9 nuns vanished without a trace one summer night in 1980. No bodies. No clues. No witnesses. For decades, silence covered the truth. Until, 38 years later, a priest stumbled upon something that would change everything. Picture this: a small Northern California village where everyone knows everyone. Where the church bells mark the rhythm of daily life. Where faith runs deeper than the roots of century-old oak trees. In this place of peace and prayer, 9 devoted women of God simply disappeared. What could make 9 devoted women of faith disappear together? Women who had dedicated their lives to service, to prayer, to their community? What force could be so powerful, so complete, that it could erase 9 human beings from existence, as if they had never walked this earth? The authorities searched for months. The FBI launched investigations. Psychics claimed to have visions. Yet nothing, absolutely nothing, explained how 9 nuns could vanish from a locked convent without leaving behind a single trace. But secrets have a way of surfacing. Truth has a way of demanding to be heard. And sometimes, the most shocking revelations come from the last person you'd expect to break their silence. To this day, locals whisper that something unnatural was behind their disappearance. Something that defies explanation. Something that challenges everything we think we know about faith, trust, and the darkness that can lurk beneath even the most sacred places. What you're about to hear will shake you to your core. Sheriff Robert Coleman had been protecting Mount Serenity for 23 years. He'd handled his share of missing persons cases, mostly teenagers who ran off to the city and returned within a week, sheepish and homesick. But 9 nuns disappearing simultaneously? This was beyond anything in his experience. By noon on August 16th, every available law enforcement officer in the county had descended upon the small village. Search teams spread out across the surrounding forests, following hiking trails, checking abandoned cabins, combing through dense underbrush that hadn't been disturbed in decades. Bloodhounds were brought in from Sacramento. They picked up the nuns' scents inside the convent, but lost the trail completely at the front entrance, as if the 9 women had simply evaporated the moment they stepped outside. The local volunteer fire department dragged the nearby Serenity River. Nothing. Helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights piercing the forest canopy. Nothing. Every building in the village was searched from cellar to attic. Nothing. It was during this chaos that Father Elias Martinez emerged as a key figure in the investigation. At 45, he was a tall, gaunt man with prematurely gray hair and intense dark eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the world. He had been the parish priest at St. Catherine's for 8 years, working closely with the nuns in all matters of faith and community service. Father Elias was the one who had discovered the nuns missing when Thomas Mitchell ran to him, after calling the sheriff. He was the one who unlocked the convent's private areas for the investigators. And he was the one who seemed most affected by their disappearance. They were devoted to God and to this community, he told the investigators, his voice barely above a whisper. These women wouldn't have left willingly. Something terrible has happened to them. But as the investigation progressed, some troubling questions began to emerge about Father Elias himself. Deputy Sarah Walsh noticed that the priest seemed to know exactly where everything was in the convent. He led investigators directly to Sister Anne's hidden archive in the basement, where decades of records were stored. He knew about Sister Teresa's private safe behind the painting in the Mother Superior's office. He even knew which floorboard in Sister Catherine's room creaked when stepped on. How did a priest know such intimate details about the nuns' private living spaces? The community's panic grew with each passing day. Mount Serenity had always been a place where people felt safe, where children rode their bicycles to school without fear, where front doors remained unlocked. Now parents kept their children indoors after dark. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. And the theories began to spread like wildfire. Cult abduction was the first theory to gain traction. The late 1970s and early 1980s had seen a rise in cult activity across California. The People's Temple tragedy in Jonestown was still fresh in everyone's memory. Could a charismatic cult leader have somehow convinced 9 devoted nuns to abandon their vows and follow him? Then came the kidnapping theory. 9 women could be worth a considerable ransom, especially if their captors believed the Catholic Church would pay to get them back safely. But no ransom demands ever arrived. The FBI arrived on August 20th, led by Agent Rebecca Torres, a specialist in organized crime and cult activity. She brought with her a team of forensic experts and behavioral analysts who transformed the quiet convent into a bustling crime scene. Agent Torres was immediately struck by the lack of physical evidence. "In 30 years of law enforcement, I've never seen a crime scene this clean," she told the local media. "It's as if these women walked out of their lives and into thin air." The forensic team found something interesting in the chapel. Under ultraviolet light, they discovered what appeared to be footprints on the stone floor. Not just the nuns' footprints, but larger prints as well. Men's shoes size 11 and 12. But the prints were faint and could have been from any number of visitors who had attended recent services. More intriguing was the discovery of a small amount of an unknown substance on the altar rail. Chemical analysis would later reveal it to be a rare type of incense, not typically used in Catholic ceremonies. The incense contained traces of plants native to Central America, specifically, herbs associated with indigenous spiritual practices. This discovery led to a new theory: ritual abduction. Had the nuns been taken by practitioners of some ancient religion? Were they victims of a sacrificial ceremony? The investigation took a bizarre turn when local resident Martha Hendricks came forward with a claim that would haunt the case for decades. Martha lived alone in a cabin on the edge of the forest, about half a mile from the convent. She was known in the village as an eccentric recluse who collected herbs and read tarot cards for tourists. Most people dismissed her as harmless but slightly unhinged. But Martha insisted she had seen something on the night of August 15th that no one wanted to believe. "I couldn't sleep," she told Agent Torres. "The forest was too quiet. Even the crickets had stopped chirping. Around midnight, I heard singing. Hymns. Beautiful voices singing hymns I'd never heard before. The melody was haunting, almost otherworldly. I looked out my window and saw lights moving through the trees." Martha claimed she had put on her robe and followed the lights and the singing deeper into the forest. What she said she saw next defied belief. 9 figures in white robes, walking in a single line through the trees. They were singing, but their voices seemed to come from everywhere at once, like the forest itself was singing with them. "Could you identify any of them?" "They had their hoods up, but I could tell they were women. They moved with such purpose, such grace. They weren't being forced or coerced. They were choosing to walk deeper into the forest." "Where did they go?" "They walked toward Serenity Falls, up the old logging trail that hasn't been used in 20 years. I tried to follow, but the singing stopped, and the lights disappeared. It was like they had walked right into the mountain itself." Most investigators dismissed Martha's account as the fantasy of an isolated woman desperate for attention. But when search teams explored the area she described, they made a discovery that left them more confused than ever. At Serenity Falls, investigators found 9 white candles arranged in a perfect circle on a flat rock formation. The candles had burned completely down, leaving only small pools of wax. Around the circle, the ground showed signs of recent activity, not footprints exactly, but compressed earth as if people had knelt or stood in specific positions. More disturbing was what they found carved into the rock, a symbol none of them recognized. It looked like a combination of a Christian cross and something else, something older, more primitive. Local historians couldn't identify it. Religious scholars were baffled. Agent Torres photographed everything and sent the images to experts across the country. The responses were uniformly puzzling. The symbol appeared to be a hybrid of Christian and pre-Columbian indigenous iconography, but no one could determine its specific meaning or origin. As autumn arrived in Mount Serenity, the investigation began to lose momentum. Hundreds of leads had been pursued. Thousands of man-hours had been devoted to the search. Yet the 9 nuns remained as mysteriously absent as the day they disappeared. The FBI scaled back their presence. The media moved on to other stories. The search teams returned to their regular duties. But the questions remained. And in the gathering darkness of those autumn nights, residents of Mount Serenity began to report something that chilled them to the bone. The faint sound of women's voices singing hymns in the forest, always just beyond the range of understanding, always just beyond the reach of those brave enough to investigate. Were the nuns still out there, somewhere in the wilderness, continuing their devotions in some unimaginable way? Or were the sounds just the echo of grief and guilt that haunted a community that had failed to protect 9 innocent women? As winter approached, one thing became clear. The disappearance of the Mount Serenity nuns would not be solved quickly. And for some residents of the village, the greatest fear wasn't that the nuns were dead. It was that they might still be alive, somewhere in the darkness, and that whatever had taken them might someday return for others. But when investigators searched that same forest, what they found left them more confused than ever. By the spring of 1981, the story of Mount Serenity's missing nuns had captured the attention of the entire nation. Magazine covers featured their photographs. Television specials explored every theory. The small village that had once been known only to locals and the occasional hiker was now a destination for journalists, psychics, and curiosity seekers. The headlines were sensational and heartbreaking. 9 nuns vanish without a trace. Did a cult claim California's missing sisters? The Mount Serenity mystery, a town's faith shaken. The media attention brought new leads, but also new chaos. Every psychic in California claimed to have visions about the nuns' fate. Self-proclaimed experts arrived daily with theories ranging from alien abduction to government cover-ups. The local sheriff's office was overwhelmed with tips, confessions, and conspiracy theories. Agent Rebecca Torres had assembled a dedicated task force that pursued every credible lead with methodical determination. 3 primary theories emerged, each supported by compelling but incomplete evidence. The first theory centered on cult involvement. The discovery of the unusual incense and the mysterious symbol at Serenity Falls suggested that the nuns might have been targeted by a religious sect practicing some form of syncretic spirituality, a blend of Christianity and indigenous beliefs. Investigators tracked down reports of similar cults operating throughout Northern California. They found several groups that fit the profile: charismatic leaders, isolated compounds, and a history of recruiting from mainstream religious communities. One particularly promising lead involved a group called the Children of the Sacred Mountain, led by a former Catholic priest named Marcus Zavala, who had been defrocked in 1978 for promoting heretical doctrines. Zavala had established a commune about 40 miles east of Mount Serenity, where his followers reportedly practiced a mixture of Catholicism and Native American spiritualism. When FBI agents raided the compound, they found evidence of unusual religious practices. Altars decorated with both crucifixes and pre-Columbian artifacts, ceremonial robes similar to those described by Martha Hendricks, and books detailing ancient rituals that involved spiritual transformation and transcendence of earthly bonds. But they didn't find the nuns. Zavala claimed he had never been to Mount Serenity and knew nothing about the missing women. His followers provided alibis confirming that he had been at the compound during the entire month of August 1980. Polygraph tests were inconclusive, and without physical evidence connecting him to the disappearance, authorities were forced to release him. The second theory suggested that the nuns had orchestrated their own disappearance. This possibility gained traction when investigators discovered that Sister Teresa, who managed the convent's finances, had been asking unusual questions about church assets in the weeks before the disappearance. Sister Mary Catherine from a neighboring convent revealed that Sister Teresa had approached her in July 1980 with hypothetical questions. What would happen to a convent's assets if all the nuns disappeared? Could the diocese seize the property? What rights would the community have? Financial records showed that the nuns had been experiencing increasing pressure from the diocese to modernize their operations and reduce their charitable activities. Bishop Andrew Morrison had sent several letters threatening to close St. Catherine's if they couldn't demonstrate better financial management. Had the 9 nuns chosen to disappear rather than see their life's work dismantled by church bureaucracy? Did they have a secret plan to continue their mission elsewhere, free from institutional constraints? This theory was supported by the fact that several of the nuns had been questioning certain church policies. Sister Catherine had been reprimanded for allowing unmarried pregnant women to stay at the convent. Sister Frances had been criticized for providing medical care to patients who couldn't pay the church's fees. Sister Dorothy had been composing music that incorporated non-traditional spiritual themes. But if they had planned their own disappearance, where were they? How could 9 women survive for months without accessing bank accounts or contacting family members? And why would they choose to cause such anguish to the community they had served so faithfully? The third theory was the darkest, that the nuns had been murdered to cover up a scandal within the church hierarchy. This possibility emerged when investigators began examining the convent's correspondence with the diocese more carefully. They discovered that Sister Anne, the convent's historian, had been researching irregularities in church financial records dating back several decades. Her private notes, found hidden in a hollowed-out book in her room, contained references to disturbing discrepancies and questions that demand answers. She had been corresponding with officials in Rome about concerns regarding the management of church assets in the American diocese. Most troubling was a letter she had written to a Vatican investigator just 2 weeks before the disappearance. The evidence I have gathered suggests a pattern of financial impropriety that reaches the highest levels of our regional church leadership. I fear that my investigations may have put my sisters and myself in danger. If something should happen to us, please know that the truth must not be buried with us. This letter had never been sent. It was found in Sister Anne's desk drawer, sealed but unstamped. When FBI agents attempted to interview Bishop Morrison about these allegations, he refused to cooperate without Vatican approval. Church lawyers argued that the investigation was overstepping constitutional boundaries regarding the separation of church and state. The stonewalling by church officials only fueled more speculation. What were they trying to hide? Were the 9 nuns martyrs who had died protecting church secrets? Or were they whistleblowers who had been silenced before they could expose corruption? As the months turned to years, the case officially remained open but received fewer resources. The FBI task force was disbanded. Agent Torres was reassigned to other cases. Sheriff Coleman continued to follow up on occasional leads, but the trail had grown cold. The absence of the nuns left a profound void in Mount Serenity. The school they had run closed permanently. The medical clinic was shuttered. The charitable programs that had helped dozens of families were discontinued. The convent itself stood empty, its windows boarded up, its gardens growing wild. But perhaps the most disturbing development was the emergence of supernatural reports that began to plague the village. It started with the Hendersons, the elderly couple who lived across from the convent. They reported hearing piano music coming from the empty building at night. Specifically, the hymn that Sister Dorothy had been composing for the anniversary celebration. When Sheriff Coleman investigated, he found no signs of forced entry. The old piano in the chapel was covered with dust and hadn't been played in months. Yet the Hendersons insisted they heard the music almost nightly. Soon, other residents began reporting similar experiences. Maria Santos, who ran the village grocery store, claimed she saw figures in white robes walking through the abandoned convent garden on misty mornings. When she approached, the figures would disappear. Children began avoiding the area around St. Catherine's completely. They whispered stories about ghostly nuns who would appear to those who ventured too close to the empty building, reaching out with pale hands as if trying to communicate something important, but being unable to speak. The village teenagers dared each other to spend nights near the convent, but few accepted the challenge. Those who did often returned with stories of unexplained sounds. Footsteps in empty hallways, voices raised in prayer, and the soft rustling of fabric as if robed figures were moving just beyond sight. Dr. Patricia Walsh, a psychiatrist brought in by the county to help residents cope with the trauma, diagnosed the phenomena as collective psychological response to unresolved grief. When a community experiences a traumatic loss without closure, she explained, it's not uncommon for people to report experiences that seem supernatural, but are actually manifestations of their psychological need for resolution. But not everyone accepted the psychological explanation. Father Elias, who had remained in Mount Serenity to minister to the remaining Catholics, began to speak about the disappearance in increasingly mystical terms. During his Sunday sermons, he would hint at spiritual forces beyond human understanding, at mysteries that required faith rather than investigation to comprehend. Perhaps, he would say from the pulpit, our sisters have been called to a different kind of service, in a realm where earthly investigators cannot follow. Perhaps their disappearance is not a tragedy but a translation, a calling to a higher purpose that we, in our limited human understanding, cannot grasp. Some parishioners found comfort in this spiritual interpretation. Others were disturbed by what seemed like Father Elias's willingness to abandon the search for earthly answers. As the years passed, the case took on an almost mythological quality. True crime enthusiasts made pilgrimages to Mount Serenity. Ghost hunters set up equipment in the abandoned convent. Documentary filmmakers interviewed residents who claimed to have ongoing supernatural encounters. The village itself began to change. Some residents moved away, unable to cope with the constant reminders of the unsolved mystery. Others stayed but seemed perpetually on edge, as if expecting the impossible to happen again at any moment. Young couples stopped moving to Mount Serenity. Tourism declined. Businesses closed. What had once been a thriving small community began to shrink and fade, haunted by the absence of 9 women who had been its heart and soul. Local real estate values plummeted. The convent property, owned by the diocese, remained unsold despite multiple attempts to find buyers. No one wanted to live in a place associated with such an inexplicable tragedy. By 1990, 10 years after the disappearance, Mount Serenity had become a ghost town in all but name. The population had dwindled to less than 2,000. The few remaining businesses served mostly curiosity seekers and paranormal investigators. The annual memorial service for the 9 nuns, held every August 15th, drew larger crowds than the village's regular church attendance. People came from across the country to participate in the vigil, lighting candles and saying prayers for women they had never met but whose story had touched their hearts. But as the 1990s progressed, even the media attention began to fade. New mysteries captured public attention. The Mount Serenity nuns became a footnote in books about unsolved disappearances, a cautionary tale about the limits of human investigation. July 20, 1980. Someone has been watching us. Sister Margaret Rose denies it, but we all feel the eyes upon us during evening prayers. Sister Ann found footprints outside her window this morning. They weren't there yesterday. July 28, 1980. Father Elias seems different lately. Distracted. When I asked him about the strange incense smell in the chapel, he changed the subject quickly. Sister Frances says she's noticed men in dark clothing in the village, strangers who ask too many questions about our routines. August 5, 1980. Sister Ann showed us documents she found in the diocesan archives. Financial records that don't match what we've been told about church funding. She believes someone has been stealing from the parishes for decades. She wants to contact Rome directly, but Sister Margaret Rose is afraid of retaliation. August 12, 1980, we've made our decision. If they come for us, we won't go quietly. Sister Ann has documented everything and hidden copies in 3 different locations. The truth will survive even if we don't. The final entry was dated August 15, 1980, the day of their disappearance. August 15, 1980, it's time. Father Elias brought them here tonight. Men we don't recognize, but who seem to know everything about us. They say we have a choice. Disappear quietly or face consequences that will destroy not just us, but our families and the entire community we've served. They've given us until midnight to decide. We are praying for guidance, but I fear God has turned his face from us. If anyone finds this, know that we did not choose to leave. We were taken. And Father Elias, God forgive him, he let them take us. Sheriff Rodriguez felt sick as she read the entries aloud to her team. The implications were staggering. The nuns hadn't disappeared mysteriously, they had been kidnapped. And Father Elias had been involved from the beginning. But the evidence raised as many questions as it answered. If the nuns had been taken against their will, where were their bodies? Why had their captors allowed them to hide their belongings in this secret chamber? And most disturbing of all, what had Father Elias been hiding for 38 years? The forensic examination revealed more troubling details. Bloodstains were found on the stone floor of the chamber. Not large amounts, but enough to suggest violence. DNA analysis would later confirm that the blood belonged to at least 3 different people, none of whom matched any database records. More mysterious were the symbols carved into the chamber walls. Unlike the hybrid Christian indigenous symbol found at Serenity Falls, these markings appeared to be purely Christian: crosses, fish symbols, and Latin phrases from Scripture. But they had been carved crudely, as if by someone under extreme duress. One message, carved deep into the stone near the chamber's entrance, sent chills through everyone who read it. Peccavi contra caelum et coram te. Latin for, I have sinned against heaven and before you. Had one of the nuns carved this confession? Or had their captor left this message as some twisted form of justification for his crimes? The investigation team also discovered something that would prove crucial to understanding the timeline of events. A newspaper dated August 20th, 1980, hidden beneath one of the habits. Someone had been in the chamber after the nun's official disappearance date. Someone had continued to visit this secret room, perhaps to pray, perhaps to remember, perhaps to gloat over their victory. As word of the discovery spread, media attention returned to Mount Serenity with unprecedented intensity. News trucks lined the village's few streets. Reporters interviewed anyone willing to talk about the case. Experts offered theories about what the chamber revelations meant for understanding the nun's fate. Father Elias, however, remained silent. Despite repeated requests for interviews, he refused to speak publicly about what he knew. His only statement came through his attorney. Father Martinez is cooperating fully with law enforcement and asks for privacy during this difficult time. But privacy was the last thing Father Elias would receive. Protesters gathered outside his modest house, some demanding justice for the nuns, others calling him a murderer and demanding his immediate arrest. Death threats arrived daily. Windows were broken. His car tires were slashed. The psychological pressure proved overwhelming for the elderly priest. On May 3, 2018, just 3 weeks after the chamber discovery, Father Elias suffered a massive heart attack while walking to morning mass. Paramedics rushed him to the county hospital, but his condition was critical. Sheriff Rodriguez was at his bedside when he regained consciousness. She knew this might be her only opportunity to learn the complete truth about what had happened in 1980. "Father," she said gently, "you're very sick. If you want to make peace with God and with those 9 women, you need to tell me everything. Now." Father Elias's eyes filled with tears. His voice was weak, but clear as he began to speak. "I was young, ambitious. I wanted to advance in the church hierarchy, and I was told that certain accommodations would be necessary. Men came to me in 1979. Diocese officials, they said. They explained that some of the nuns were asking dangerous questions about church finances, questions that could embarrass important people." He paused, struggling for breath. Sheriff Rodriguez waited patiently. They promised that the nuns would not be harmed. They just needed to disappear for a while, until certain investigations were concluded. They showed me documents proving that Sister and had been planning to expose financial irregularities that reached the highest levels of church leadership. They said if she succeeded, it would destroy faith in the Catholic Church throughout California. "What did they ask you to do?" "I was to give them access to the convent, to ensure that the nuns were in the chapel at a specific time on August 15th. I was told they would be relocated to a secure facility where they could continue their religious life without interfering in church business." Father Elias began to weep. "I believed them. God forgive me. I believed that I was protecting the church. I never never imagined." What happened that night? The men arrived at 11 p.m. Professional. Cold. They weren't diocese officials. I realized that the moment I saw them. They were something else. Something darker. They had weapons, restraints. When I tried to object, they told me it was too late to change my mind. Father Elias described how the nuns had been forced into the secret chamber, how they had pleaded with him to help them, how they had looked at him with such betrayal and fear. "They made me watch," he whispered. "They wanted me to understand the consequences of betraying them." The nuns were so brave, so dignified, even in their terror. They prayed together until the end. The end. Father Elias closed his eyes. They were taken away in a van that night. I never saw them again. But I received a message the next morning. "They are gone. Do not search." I knew what it meant. I knew they were dead. Sheriff Rodriguez felt her heart pounding. "Why didn't you tell the truth during the original investigation?" "Because they threatened my family. My sister's children. They showed me photographs of my nephews walking to school. They made it clear that my silence was the only thing keeping innocent people alive." The confession continued for another hour, with Father Elias revealing details about the men who had orchestrated the kidnapping, the vehicles they had used, and the coded messages he had received over the years confirming that his silence was still required. But even this dramatic confession left crucial questions unanswered. Who were the men behind the kidnapping? Were they acting on behalf of corrupt church officials? Or were they part of some other organization? And most importantly, where were the nuns' bodies? Father Elias died that evening, taking his remaining secrets to the grave. His final words, whispered to the hospital chaplain, were, "Tell their families I'm sorry. Tell them I've prayed for forgiveness every day for 38 years." The discovery of the secret chamber and Father Elias's deathbed confession transformed the case from an unsolved mystery into an active murder investigation. For the first time in decades, law enforcement had concrete evidence of criminal activity and specific leads to pursue. But as investigators would soon learn, some secrets run deeper than even a dying man's confession can reveal. And the most shocking revelations about the fate of the 9 nuns were still waiting to be uncovered. And then, at the very back of the chamber, Father Elias found something that shook even the most faithful to their core. The weeks following Father Elias's death brought a flood of new information that transformed the investigation into something far more complex and disturbing than anyone had imagined. His confession had provided the first concrete evidence of foul play, but it had also opened doors to a conspiracy that reached far beyond Mount Serenity. Detective Sarah Morrison, a specialist in cold case investigations brought in from Sacramento, began the painstaking process of verifying Father Elias's claims. The coded messages he had described were found exactly where he said they would be, hidden in a hollowed-out Bible in his personal library. 23 messages spanning nearly 4 decades, each one a reminder that his silence was still required. The messages were brief and cryptic. The garden remains peaceful. The harvest was successful. Seeds planted long ago continue to bear fruit. But investigators recognized them for what they truly were. Confirmations that the 9 nuns were dead, and that any attempt to investigate their fate would result in more violence. Most chilling was a message dated just 2 months before Father Elias's public confession. Old trees sometimes fall. New growth requires careful tending. It was a clear threat. Keep quiet or face the consequences. The breakthrough came when forensic accountants began examining the financial records that Sister Ann had been investigating before her disappearance. Working with documents recovered from the secret chamber and archives from the Sacramento diocese, they uncovered a sophisticated embezzlement scheme that had operated for decades. Church funds designated for charitable work, school programs, and building maintenance had been systematically diverted to private accounts controlled by a network of corrupt officials. The scheme involved not just local priests and bishops, but contractors, city officials, and even members of law enforcement who had been paid to look the other way. Sister Ann's research had identified specific transactions totaling more than $8 million over a 15-year period. Her meticulously documented evidence would have exposed dozens of individuals and destroyed careers throughout Northern California's religious and political establishment. The financial motive for silencing the nuns became clear, but investigators still needed to identify the specific individuals who had ordered their deaths. The first break came from an unexpected source. Marcus Zavala, the defrocked priest who had been investigated and cleared in 1980, now in his 70s and suffering from dementia, Zavala had been moved to a care facility where he sometimes spoke about events from his past. A nurse at the facility contacted authorities after Zavala repeatedly mentioned the 9 angels who asked too many questions during his confused rambling. When investigators interviewed him during one of his lucid moments, he revealed information that no innocent person should have known. "They came to me first," Zavala said, his eyes distant with memory. "Before they went to the young priest in Mount Serenity. They wanted me to help with the nuns, but I refused. I told them I was many things, but I was not a murderer." "Who came to you?" "Bishop Morrison's men. They had a problem. Some nuns were threatening to expose financial irregularities. They needed someone with connections to handle the situation quietly." Zavala's testimony led investigators to Bishop Andrew Morrison, who had died in 1995. But Morrison's personal papers, sealed in church archives, contained correspondence that revealed the scope of the conspiracy. In letters to other diocesan officials, Morrison had written about the Mount Serenity problem and the need for permanent solutions to temporary difficulties. He had recommended hiring outside specialists to handle situations that regular church discipline couldn't resolve. The outside specialists were identified through financial records as members of a criminal organization based in Los Angeles. The group, known to law enforcement as the Cleaners, specialized in making problems disappear permanently for wealthy clients who couldn't afford scandals. FBI agents tracked down surviving members of the organization, now scattered across the country. Most had died or disappeared over the decades, but 2 men were still alive and serving prison sentences for other crimes. Antonio Tony Marcelli, 78, was serving life without parole for multiple murders committed in the 1990s. When confronted with evidence of his involvement in the Nuns' disappearance, he initially denied everything. But faced with the possibility of additional charges and the complete loss of his prison privileges, he eventually agreed to cooperate. Marcelli's testimony was devastating. "We got the contract in July 1980. 9 targets, all women, all nuns. The client wanted it to look like they had disappeared voluntarily. No bodies, no evidence, no investigation. The payment was substantial, enough to retire on." What happened to the nuns? "We took them from the convent on August 15th, just like the priest said. They were transported to a facility in Nevada where they were held for several days while we decided how to proceed. The original plan was to relocate them somewhere remote where they couldn't cause problems. But that's not what happened." Marcelli's expression hardened. The client changed the specifications, said the situation was too dangerous, that relocation wasn't permanent enough. "We received new orders on August 18th. The second surviving member, Vincent Vinny Torino, 74, corroborated Marcelli's account with additional details that painted a horrifying picture of the nuns' final days. "They knew what was going to happen," Torino said during his interview with federal agents. "These weren't naive women. They understood exactly why they had been taken and what their research had uncovered. But they never stopped praying, never stopped trying to comfort each other." "Where did you take them?" "A remote location in the Nevada desert. An abandoned mining facility that the client had identified as suitable for disposal. The nuns were told they were being relocated to a monastery in Mexico, but I don't think any of them believed it." Torino described how the nuns had spent their final hours writing farewell letters to their families and documenting their forgiveness for those who had wronged them. They had asked to be allowed to pray together one final time, a request that was granted. "That I've done terrible things in my life," Torino said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "But those women, they faced death with such dignity, such grace. They prayed for us, even knowing what we were about to do to them." The testimony from both men led investigators to the Nevada desert location where the nuns had been murdered. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed the presence of human remains buried in a remote canyon approximately 40 miles southeast of Las Vegas. The excavation took weeks. Forensic anthropologists worked meticulously to recover and identify the remains of 9 women who had been buried in unmarked graves for 38 years. DNA analysis confirmed what investigators already knew. These were the remains of the 9 missing nuns from Mount Serenity. Each woman had died from a single gunshot wound to the head. Their personal effects had been buried with them, rosaries, prayer books, and letters they had written to their families in their final hours. The letters were heartbreaking in their compassion and forgiveness. From Sister Catherine: "Please tell my parents that I died serving God, and that I hold no anger in my heart for those who have taken my life. I pray that they will find peace and forgiveness." From Sister Margaret Rose: "To my beloved community in Mount Serenity, continue the work we started. Help the poor, educate the children, comfort the sick. Do not let our deaths be the end of our mission." From Sister Anne: "The truth I died trying to reveal is not more important than the love we shared. Remember us not as victims, but as women who lived fully in service to others." The recovery of the remains and the testimony from their killers finally provided closure to the families who had waited 38 years for answers. But it also revealed the stunning scope of corruption that had made their murders necessary. Federal prosecutors filed charges against 23 individuals involved in the financial conspiracy that had motivated the killings. The indictments included 3 bishops, 7 priests, 12 laypeople involved in church business, and 1 retired FBI agent who had been paid to misdirect the original investigation. The Catholic Church faced massive civil lawsuits from the nuns' families and the Mount Serenity community. The diocese was forced to pay more than $50 million in settlements and establish a victims' compensation fund for communities affected by clerical corruption. But even with the mystery solved and justice finally served, questions remained about the full extent of the conspiracy. How many other whistleblowers had been silenced over the decades? How many other communities had been victimized by corrupt church officials? Most disturbing was the realization that the cover-up had continued long after the original murders. Evidence emerged that high-ranking church officials had known about the nuns' fate, but had chosen to maintain the fiction of their mysterious disappearance rather than face the scandal of admitting that they had been murdered to protect financial crimes. As the investigation concluded, Mount Serenity began the process of healing from 4 decades of uncertainty and grief. The remains of the 9 nuns were returned to their families for proper burial. A memorial service attended by hundreds of people celebrated their lives and their courage in standing up to corruption. The abandoned convent was purchased by a foundation established in the nuns' honor. Plans were announced to restore the building and convert it into a retreat center dedicated to social justice and community service, the work that the 9 women had died trying to protect. But even with the case finally solved, one final piece of evidence still lay hidden, waiting to transform the story from a tale of corruption and murder into something even more profound and shocking. And even with these discoveries, one final piece of evidence still lay hidden, waiting to be uncovered. In September 2019, more than a year after the discovery of the secret chamber and the recovery of the nuns' remains, renovation work began on the old St. Catherine's Convent. The building was being transformed into the Sisters of Mount Serenity Retreat Center, a place where people could come to reflect on issues of social justice and community service. Construction worker Miguel Santos was removing damaged floorboards from what had once been Sister Anne's office when his crowbar struck something metallic hidden beneath the subflooring. What he found would provide the final, devastating piece of the puzzle that had haunted Mount Serenity for nearly 4 decades. Wrapped in waterproof material and sealed in a metal container was a complete dossier that Sister Anne had compiled in the weeks before her death. The documents she had hidden represented months of painstaking investigation into financial irregularities that went far beyond what anyone had previously imagined. Sister Anne hadn't just discovered routine embezzlement. She had uncovered evidence of a systematic conspiracy that involved money laundering for organized crime, the sale of church property to developers at below-market prices, and the use of charitable donations to fund illegal political activities. Most shocking was her discovery that the corruption wasn't limited to the California diocese. Her correspondence with contacts in other states revealed that similar schemes were operating throughout the American Catholic Church, coordinated by a network of officials who had been skimming funds for decades. But the most devastating evidence concerned the attempted cover-up after the nuns' murders. Sister Anne had somehow learned about the plan to silence her and her fellow nuns, and she had documented everything in a final report that read like a prophetic condemnation of those who would kill her. The report's conclusion was chilling in its accuracy. If we are found dead or missing, it will not be because we chose to leave our calling. It will be because we refused to remain silent about crimes committed in the name of God. We have prepared this evidence so that our deaths will not be in vain. The truth will survive even if we do not. Sister Anne had been right. The truth had survived, hidden beneath the floorboards of her office for 39 years, waiting for someone to discover it and ensure that justice was finally served. The discovery of Sister Anne's final report led to additional prosecutions and revealed the full scope of the conspiracy that had cost 9 innocent women their lives. But it also provided something even more valuable: a complete picture of who these women had been and what they had sacrificed for the sake of truth and justice. Their personal writings, recovered from various hiding places throughout the convent, revealed women of extraordinary courage and compassion who had chosen to risk everything rather than remain silent in the face of injustice. They had known the danger they faced, Yet they had continued their investigation because they believed that protecting the vulnerable was more important than protecting themselves. Sister Catherine's diary contained her final prayer, written on the night before their disappearance. God, give us the strength to do what is right, even if it costs us everything. Help our community understand that we did not choose to leave them, but that we chose to serve them in the only way our consciences would allow. The annual memorial service on August 15, 2020, the 40th anniversary of their disappearance, drew more than 2,000 people to Mount Serenity. Families of the murdered nuns spoke about their loved ones' dedication to justice. Community members shared memories of the women who had taught their children, tended their sick, and fed their hungry. Bishop Maria Gonzalez, who had been appointed to oversee reforms in the diocese, delivered a homily that acknowledged the Church's failures and committed to ensuring that such tragedies would never happen again. These 9 women died because they chose truth over comfort, justice over security, and service over self-preservation, she said. Their legacy challenges all of us to examine our own consciences and ask whether we have the courage to stand up for what is right, even when it is difficult or dangerous. Father James Sullivan, who had been assigned to serve the restored parish, established new programs that honored the nuns' memory through direct action. The Sisters of Mount Serenity Social Justice Initiative provided legal aid to whistleblowers, financial assistance to corruption victims, and advocacy for institutional reform. The retreat center opened in 2021, welcoming visitors from around the world who came to learn about the nuns' story and reflect on their own commitments to justice and service. Interactive exhibits told the story of the investigation, but the focus was always on the women themselves, their lives, their values, and their ultimate sacrifice. Dr. Patricia Walsh, the psychiatrist who had studied the community's response to trauma, noted that the resolution of the mystery had allowed Mount Serenity to begin genuine healing for the first time in 4 decades. For years, this community lived with uncertainty, fear, and supernatural explanations for events they couldn't understand, she observed. Learning the truth, as terrible as it was, allowed them to grieve properly and begin rebuilding their lives around something positive. The village itself experienced a modest revival. Young families began moving to Mount Serenity, drawn by affordable housing and a sense of community that had been rebuilt around principles of transparency and mutual support. New businesses opened. The school system was revitalized. Property values began to recover. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in how the community approached issues of justice and accountability. Town meetings were open to all residents. Financial records were made publicly available. Citizens established oversight committees to ensure that local officials served the public interest rather than private gain. The transformation wasn't complete, and healing from such deep trauma takes generations. But Mount Serenity had become something new. A community that understood the price of silence and the value of courage. As investigators concluded their work and families finally laid their loved ones to rest, the question that had haunted the case for 4 decades was finally answered. The 9 nuns hadn't disappeared mysteriously, or chosen to abandon their calling. They had been murdered because they refused to remain silent about corruption and injustice. These women believed that some things are more important than personal safety, she said during the closing ceremony at the retreat center. They chose to investigate corruption even when they knew it might cost them their lives. That kind of courage is rare, and it deserves to be remembered and honored. But even with the case solved and justice served, some mysteries remained. The supernatural experiences reported by residents over the decades were never fully explained. Some dismissed them as collective psychological trauma. Others believed that the nuns' spirits had remained in Mount Serenity, trying to communicate the truth about their fate, until someone finally listened. Margaret Henderson, now 92 and one of the few survivors who had lived through the entire saga, offered her own interpretation. Those weren't ghosts that people saw and heard all those years. Those were the nuns' souls calling out for justice. Once we finally learned the truth and honored their memory properly, the strange phenomena stopped. They found peace because we finally found the truth. Whether supernatural or psychological, the experiences had served a purpose. They had kept the mystery alive in the community's consciousness, ensuring that the 9 nuns were never forgotten, and that someone would eventually have the courage to seek the truth about their fate. As the 40th anniversary of their disappearance approached, Mount Serenity had become a symbol of redemption and renewal. The village that had been nearly destroyed by tragedy and uncertainty had rebuilt itself around principles of truth, justice, and service to others. The 9 nuns of Mount Serenity had achieved in death what they had worked for in life. A community committed to protecting the vulnerable, exposing corruption, and ensuring that no one would suffer in silence while others looked the way. Their names were inscribed on a memorial in the center of the village. Sister Margaret Rose, Sister Catherine, Sister Anne, Sister Patricia, Sister Dorothy, Sister Frances, Sister Mary Joseph, Sister Teresa, and Sister Elizabeth. Below their names was a simple inscription. They chose truth over comfort, justice over security, and service over self-preservation. May we follow their example. In the end, the question was not whether these women were victims of a cover-up or willing participants in their own disappearance. The evidence had made that clear. They were murdered because they refused to remain silent about injustice. The real question was whether their sacrifice would inspire others to show similar courage when confronted with corruption and wrongdoing. Whether people would choose to speak up for truth, even when it was dangerous or difficult. That question remains open, waiting for each of us to answer through our own choices and actions. The legacy of the 9 nuns of Mount Serenity lives on in everyone who chooses to stand up for justice, protect the vulnerable, and refuse to remain silent in the face of corruption. Were these women victims of a cover-up? Yes, they were murdered to protect a criminal conspiracy. Did they choose to vanish for reasons we may never understand? No, they were killed because they chose to investigate and expose the truth. But their story is ultimately not about death and corruption. It's about courage, faith, and the power of truth to survive even the most determined efforts to bury it. It's about 9 women who chose to serve others even unto death, and a community that learned to honor that sacrifice by building something better from the ashes of tragedy. What do you think? When confronted with injustice, will you have the courage that these 9 women showed? Will you choose truth over comfort, justice over security, service over self-preservation? The nuns of Mount Serenity answered that question with their lives. Now it's your turn to answer it with yours.